right. Welcome to our ongoing series, Machine Learning with Spark and Cassandra. Today's webinar is about cross-validation. This is part, I want to say 4, but we'll see for sure on the next slide. We'll be talking about cross-validation. We'll go through a short discussion of what cross-validation is, the nature of some of the different types of cross-validation. We'll move on to a demo. And we'll have time for questions at the end and also in between this presentation and the demo. As you heard, my name is Obi Anamnachi. I'm a contractor with a non-corporation. Yes, this is part 4 of Machine Learning with Spark and Cassandra. We previously talked about the environment we're using, which is a Dockerized setup with Spark and Cassandra using through DSE. We've talked about data preprocessing, testing. Now we're talking about cross-validation. Next time we'll talk about model selection tests and move on to deployment, all the different types of the different ways that we use our models after training. So this presentation is focused on cross-validation. So the obvious question is, what is cross-validation? How is it different from the testing we talked about last time? Last time, what we talked about was the various statistical tests that you take and apply to your machine learning models in order to extract data about their performance. This time, we're talking about validation schemes or cross-validation schemes, which are procedures for repeated training and testing of your model in order to extract more useful information out than you get from singular tests. The main thing to know, like one of the very important things to keep in mind, is that testing on your training data can be misleading. It can give you wrong ideas about how well your model is working. So you generally don't want to use those values to draw conclusions about how well your model will generalize. Therefore, the way we solve that is we pick a subset of our full data set as a test set. We train on the rest of our data, and then we proceed to test on that held out data. The way that we pick our test sets and how we shuffle between them are what defines the different validation schemes. Because we're doing repeated training and testing, we get out a number of metrics rather than a singular one as we would in our singular tests from last time that we can average together, we can take the best of. But generally, the purpose of cross-validation schemes is to fulfill the same purpose as your test procedures. You can use them when you have decided on what machine learning algorithm you're using, but not the parameters of your model, which is called hyperparameter tuning. And it can also help you decide when your model is good enough and you want to move forward onto production into deployment. So we're going to talk through a couple different types of cross-validation today. The simplest validation scheme is a train test or train test holdout split. It's very simple. You take your full data set, you split it into pieces, you train on the training set, you test on the test set. When you have a holdout set, you use your training and testing sets to do hyperparameter tuning. You change the parameters until the performance on your test set looks good. And then you train on both the training and the test sets and then test on the holdout set to make sure that your parameters are good and that there are no other problems before you move on to deployment. This type of thing is useful for diagnosing overfitting, because if your model has stuck too tightly to the original training set or even the original training and test sets together, doing some extra tests on the holdout set can let you know whether your model is overfitting, whether it'll have problems generalizing to new data because of how closely it fit to your existing data. So this is the most popular kind of cross-validation, KFold cross-validation. You take your data set and you split it into K disjoint subsets. Disjoint means there's no overlap. So each data set goes into one of the test sets. Each data point goes into one of the test sets and there's no overlap. The size of your test sets ends up being about N over K, where N is the size of your data set. They're not necessarily all equal. If n is not perfectly divisible by k, they can end up having different sizes. And then you take each in turn of your test sets that you defined. You train on all of the other data that's not part of that test set, and then you evaluate your model. What you can do is you can average over those k sets, or you can choose the best of the models that you train during this procedure. So model performance improves as k approaches n because your training set is getting bigger, but the number of folds that the number of times that you're training and testing also increases, so it takes more computing time and power. You can also use leave one out or leave one group out cross-validation. Leave one out cross-validation is that extreme example from the last one where each sample individually gets held out and acts as a test set. So it's KFold cross-validation where k is the same as the size of your data set. Leave one group out leaves out a specific subset of your data each time. Usually it's based on a feature of that data. You're not just randomly selecting because that's the same as KFold cross-validation. And this means that they can have even more different sizes than your KFold cross-validation, because your KFold cross-validation will split them into roughly equal groups, but there's no guarantee that the metric that you're using for splitting on your leave one group out cross-validation will split them into equal groups. An example of leave one group out cross-validation is if your data comes from a number of different sources and that is a feature of the data, it's inside the data set, you can split based on those sources, and each source has a term being left out, and your model will be trained on all of the other data sources, and then try and predict the held out data. This is good, especially for learning about the generalization error, because if certain features are missing from your data set, certain classes separate from label classes, but you can see how well the other data makes up for that. Nested cross-validation is a sort of more complete scheme, similar to the way the train test holdout split has an inner loop and an outer loop, where in train tests holdout, your train and test is your first loop, and then your train test data set and holdout set is your outer loop. This time the inner loop is a k-fold cross-validation, and the outer loop is also k-fold cross-validation. In this case, in the graphic over on the right, you can see that the outer loop has k equal to 5 and the inner loop has k equal to 2. We use the inner loop for parameter tuning, just like you would use your normal train and test data sets when you're working with a train test split for parameter tuning. And then the outer loop is for final accuracy estimation, to tell you about whether you're overfitting or to validate you moving on to deployment, or other steps in your machine learning process. It's possible to sub in other validation schemes for either your inner or outer loop. You could replace the inner loop with leave one out cross validation and just have your outer loop be a normal holdout set, or other things like that, depending on the exact needs of your machine learning process. So if you're working with time series data, you can't always use the other types of cross-validation, because it's possible that having data from after the data in your test set can give your model undue information about the data that it's testing on. So in this case, you still split it into k groups, well, sort of like k+1 groups, because your immediate first set cannot be used for testing since there's no data before that to train on. And then when you go on to test on a particular group X, the training data is all of the data that came in before the data that's in group X. And then something else that can help with something like diagnosing overfitting or other things like that that you use these tests for, something called a learning curve. It graphs the performance of your model versus the number of training examples. So if your cross-validation or your final test performance sharply drops off as you feed in more data, that's a sign that you're really overfitting and you're not, like, your model is no longer generalizing to new data very well. And you can take this data from a single training iteration of your model, or you can average them from your cross-validation trials. And as you can see over on the right, your final training score approaches the same number as your cross-validation score as long as you're not overfitting. All right, we'll take a short break for questions. If you have questions, I can answer them now. You can also feel free to hold them for after the demo. If you have questions, feel free to put them in chat. By the way, something I forgot to mention, the notebooks and other resources used in the demo are available on GitHub, and I can provide a link in chat during question time after we're done here. And they'll also be made available with a companion blog post to this, the next part in the series that goes up on a non-blog sometime after this, sometimes after we're done today. Okay, first question, what is your typical data size for testing? So part of it depends on your application. If you want to measure it in number of examples, that really becomes difficult because it depends on how much data you can feasibly get your hands on. So some really big companies will do machine learning with hundreds of millions of examples. Whereas if you're a smaller company or you're just a hobbyist or something, you may be using as few as 100 total examples. So it's a little bit difficult to say, but a good metric is that when you're doing your normal train test split, in this case, just train tests without a holdout set, you normally want to use around 75, 80% of your data for training and 20 to 30% for testing. Next question is, how do you standardize the cross-validation process for different models? So this is actually a topic that we're covering next time in model selection tests. But the difficulty is that just comparing the numbers that you get out from cross-validation don't necessarily tell you which model is better. And so there are specific statistical tests that basically tell you the statistical significance of your difference in results. And so you get to decide whether the difference is statistically significant, in what direction it is, and whether or not that defines which model you should pick, or maybe you should go back and choose another one. All right, I do not see any more questions in chat, so I'll move on to the demo. So the demos for this series are all contained in Jupyter notebooks. Okay, so we have collected a bunch of imports from all our previous parts in the series. The new ones for this time are linear regression, because we are testing on a regression model this time, as well as classification models, which we've worked with in the past. The evaluator for regression models, because PySpark has the classification evaluators, both binary and multi-class, which we've used in the past, that, as discussed in the testing episode, sorry, one second. As we discussed in the testing episode, do not work for regression models. I'm pasting the GitHub link to the location where all the notebooks are kept in the chat if you would like to read along or just have it for personal use. We are also importing the vectors library for data work, and then cross-validator model, cross-validator, and param grid builder, which are all used for our cross-validator that PySpark includes. We also have an example where we do this basically by hand, but we also have one where we use PySpark's inbuilt cross-validator to do it for us. So we have helper functions. There is one for formatting data frames so that we can see them well in notebooks. One from 2 parts ago to look at a correlation matrix, which we then use to do primary component, principal component analysis. And then we have one for plotting a confusion matrix, which we used last time in our testing episode. First thing we're doing is we connect to our Cassandra cluster, load data into it, and pull data out of it into Spark data frames. Restarting our notebook because it does not seem to be running properly. And starting from the beginning with our imports and our helper functions. There we go. Okay, seems to be working now. Loading our data. We're starting with the classic iris dataset. Contains, I think, 150 examples of measurements of iris flowers, which are then used to guess at, to predict the species of the flower that these measurements come from. Yes, 150 rows. You can see some of the data here. We do our pre-processing. So this is the first part where we move on into our validation scheme. Here we split our data into a training and a test set that are respectively 80% and 20% of our total data. The classifier that we're using for this is a random forest classifier. We're using it to do multi-class classification because there are 3 potential species that the measurements could have come from. And this is basically something that we've done in every previous episode, just to establish a baseline. You can see it can calculate the accuracy in the F1 score, and what it's showing is that there is exactly one wrong example in this normal random forest classifier test set. And we can look at the predictions. And if you care to look through them very carefully, you can actually find the error. It's here. And then if you actually look at the data, the reason I think that our classifier is getting this example wrong is because the values are particularly close to others that are classified a different way. So I can't for sure say whether our data is linearly separable. That is, whether a single linear decision boundary can split classes from each other, or in this case, two, because there are three potential classes. Um, but it is at least very close to being linearly separable. So moving on to here, where we use the cross validator to do fivefold cross validation. What we do first is we create our classifier, but it's blank. It does not have anything except which column is the labels and which column contains the features. We give it a grid of parameters because PySpark's cross-validator also runs through a number of different sets of parameters for our model and gives us back the best estimator that is created through the machine learning. We create our evaluator. In this case, the important thing is that we're giving it a metric name accuracy. And then we create our cross-validator. We tell it the number of folds. We give it what the estimator is, what the parameter grid is, and what the evaluator is. And then we fit model. And it also tells us how many folds we used, and then the average of the metrics that we're taking, in this case, accuracy. So the parameter grid we built only has two examples. It is trying one random forest classifier made up of 5 individual trees and one random forest classifier made up of 15 individual trees. And as you can see with fivefold cross-validation, the accuracy, well, they're both lower than the one above because if the data is not linearly separable with a small number of individual trees making up our random forest classifier, the best we can do is that 96.666%. But because we are averaging over a bunch of folds, sometimes we'll get lower than that, and thus our actual accuracy will be lower. And as you can see, we also, this is data that we've taken from doing threefold cross-validation and fivefold cross-validation. And as you can see, the values for threefold cross-validation, the accuracy values are all lower because we're actually training on less data. In the linear regression data set, which we move on to now, this is just a very simple linear regression example. It contains 2 columns, X and Y. And our regression model will, given X, it will predict Y. I don't know why I did that. All right, so this is the same sort of data pre-processing that we did above, except it's much simpler. And then this time we're doing our KFold cross-validation by hand. We're using K equals 5. So the first thing we do is we use random split to split our data into those 5 groups. And we can look at one of them. And we can see that there are 201 in this data set. Scrolling up, we should be able to see that there are 999 in the data set total. So it is not splitting them into perfectly equal groups, which I think is just part of what part of the PySpark random split, the way it splits them into groups. And then what we're doing is, well, we create our evaluators up here outside of the loop because we're using the same ones. And then further down, we have our loop, and this will run through. It will designate each split, the test split once. It will combine the rest of the data into a train split. And it works differently for 2, 3, or more, just because of the union function in PySpark and the way that it takes exactly 2 examples. So if you have only 1, you just need to feed that 1. If you have 2, you need to union them. And if you have 3, you need to union them all together, but union only takes 2 arguments. So we're doing it with a for loop. And then you create your model. In this case, we just feed it some parameters and we fit it on the current training set, whatever that happens to be. We predict based on our test set, whatever that currently happens to be. And then we take our R-square value, which is sort of a measure of correlation to the original label, and a root mean squared error, and we put them into a list. So this does take a little while to run. It looks like there's a question in chat. An error with import Cassandra. Yeah, it means that you do not have the Cassandra Python library, the driver installed or installed properly. So what we do here is we take these and we just put them into a data frame. Honestly, this took me forever to figure out because I'm really bad at manipulating like freehand PySpark data frames, but I did eventually figure it out. And then we can look at how well our predictions match up to the original data. So as you can see, this is the original linear regression, and what our model produces is all our data points actually on a line, because that's what linear regression does. It produces a function, a single line, and then it takes whatever data points comes in, and it tells you what it thinks they are based on where they fall on that line. And then we can also plot them versus each other. So in this case, all of the blue dots are the original values, and all of the orange X's are where those predictions ended up. So as you can see, they're often off a little bit, but generally pretty close to the values that they were predicted to be. That brings us to the end of the demo. Any more questions? You can put them in chat. I'll try my best to answer them. How would you automate this? Like the general training and testing of a machine learning model, or specifically cross-validation? The different parameters for testing. So as we saw a little bit, PySpark's cross-validator can do that. If you feed it in a grid of parameters, it will run through that grid of parameters, and it will test your models, go through the cross-validation for each one, and feed you out what it determines is the best model according to those cross-validation values. And then we'll also give you your averages. that it's calculated. So you can use that to compare averages for the different parameter values and then pick the best. But you can also do this yourself if if you take your cross-validation loop and you put that inside a loop with lists of parameter values that you want to check. And you can have that in the same way feed out the best model that it finds for working on your data on your particular problem. Richard, if you're having trouble getting the notebook to run properly, you might want to go back to the first blog post that's part of this series, in which we bring up the environment. It should make sure that all the prerequisites you need are already installed, and that can be found on the Anant website. If you give me a little bit, I can get you the link. Any more questions? All right, I guess we'll finish up. Thank you for coming today. Like I've said, it looks like yes. So the short answer is yes. As I mentioned briefly, the random forest classifier that we talked about is actually a version of this. So the general name for these are called consensus models. And what they do is they take a number of individual models and they combine their answers, also called ensemble learning. And the way you decide is sometimes random, like in the random forest classifier. Sometimes you give a weighted average of the answer, but various things like that. And the advantage of doing something like that, especially in specifically the case of a random forest classifier, is that normal decision tree algorithms can only give linear decision boundaries. Whereas if you combine them and have them work in different areas of the data space, they'll be able to give you more complex decision boundaries, make more complex decisions while still retaining some of the advantages of those binary tree decision tree models, which is that specifically the advantage of decision trees is that it can give you out each step along the way what decision it made that led it to its answer. It's very explainable. And some models don't have that. But basically, yes, it's very possible and sometimes very useful. Um, so if you would like to hear more, feel free to email us at solutions@anant or call at the number seen on screen. And thank you for your time.